if you look at my own background is as a historian. That's what I studied in Oxford many years ago, European history. I think in the span of church history, the last 50, 60 years has been one of the most remarkable since the first century. And I think for those of us who come from the Western world, we've been enormously privileged because it's been an era when we've had some, it's not too strong a word to say great leaders, evangelists, and apologists in the life of the church. Some are amongst the greatest in the history of the church, from my own perspective. And I've had a great opportunity since I was 20 and a student in Oxford, when I met quite a number of these folks as a young man, because as president of the Christian Union, I had to take speakers out for dinner every Saturday night before they spoke, and I used to prepare 10 questions for each speaker before they spoke, so they were exhausted when they got up to speak. And so that's when I first met people like George Verwer, N.T. Wright, Billy Graham, John Stott, J.I. Packer, these kind of folks. And some of them became lifelong friends. Some have gone to heaven now. My major work in recent years has been to try to develop a network of European evangelists and apologists. There are about 100 of us who work in a university context, giving a series of consecutive evangelistic talks. And we do that in about 200 universities each year all across Europe, in about 30, 35 of the 40 countries. We started this 15 years ago, John Lennox, Michael Green, and myself, because as I traveled around the world with IFES, I reckoned that the public university evangelist was the gift which was least in evidence in the global church. We tried to start a network in Europe in the 80s. We failed. We had 6 people, 4 British, 2 Germans, none anywhere else. But the situation changed after the fall of the Berlin Wall. God started to raise up what are now some of the most gifted public communicators, actually in Eastern Europe, especially in the Balkans. Some of them are here, actually. That often happens in the time of cultural shift. In the West, it was in the late 60s with the Jesus movement, the counterculture. If you look around, many of the significant leaders in the Western world were converted in that era, so they'd be 65 to 75 now. You just look at the Christian organizations and ask when these people were converted. Similarly, post-Berlin Wall fall, many of the most significant leaders in Europe now were converted in a 5-year period between 89 and 94, especially in southeastern Europe. Some of them are speaking at other events here. But what I want to speak about now is, my own view is, these are 5 of the 6 most outstanding evangelists and preachers of the last 50 years, or 60 years. I worked with nearly all of them. The one I knew least, but I heard speak a number of times, and my wife actually worked with him for a year, was Francis Schaeffer. The others I all knew quite well. And I want to comment principally on some of the distinctives of the ministry of each person. So I'm going to try and pick out 3 or 4 things about each of these 5 or 6 evangelists. I don't have a PowerPoint, I'm afraid, so you'll have to take notes. I might put some things up on here. But these are lessons I think we can learn from observing how these preachers and apologists / evangelists worked. They are all actually Anglo-Saxons, because one of the privileges of the Western world in the last 60 years was that God raised up some very gifted apologists and evangelists in the Anglo-Saxon world. That is shifting, as I mentioned. Some of the best of the next generation are not first language English speakers. Some of them come from Southern and Eastern Europe. That's unprecedented. I don't see that in past history. It's quite new and something that's exciting to look forward to. But I'm going to use the illustrations of these folks who've mostly gone to heaven. And the people I'm going to focus on are Martyn Lloyd-Jones, the great Welsh preacher, then also John Stott, Francis Schaeffer, David Watson, who died in his early 50s, a gifted, charismatic Anglican preacher, Michael Green, and John Lennox, who's the only one who remains alive. and has just celebrated his 80th birthday. So I'm going to try and pick out some features, distinctive features of each of these 6 people. I'll start with Lloyd-Jones, whom I first met as a teenager, and actually came to speak in Oxford. It was the last university meeting he ever took. I happened to be the Christian Union president at the time, so I had a whole weekend with him. He very kindly invited me to his home and discussed various things there. He was very good at targeting young people who he saw as potential leaders and investing in them. When I went to visit him in his home, I went with another young Welsh guy who said he was doing a thesis on preaching. It was a bit of a con because it was a 4-page essay, and it was his way of getting to see Lloyd-Jones. Anyway, because the theme was, what is preaching? The 2 of us went to his home. We were 21 years of age. And I said to him, Doctor, he's the greatest preacher I've heard, by the way. He had the edge over all the others as a preacher because he had psychological and emotional depth, which is always there as the mark of the great preacher, that searches the inward workings of the hearers. I asked him, what's the mark of great preaching? And he gave me the best answer I've ever heard. No one of contemporary preachers I've heard has said this. He said, there are 4 emphases. You start with the mind, then you apply the message to the conscience, then to the will, then to the emotions, the whole person. And the passage that he would base that on is Peter's sermon at Pentecost. If you could read through the text in Acts 2, you see that he starts with the mind by just highlighting who Jesus is, the prophetic references to Jesus in the Old Testament and the fulfillment. Jesus claims for deity, his death, his resurrection. So he's presenting the objective truths about the person and the claims of Jesus Christ, which is at the heart of gospel presentation. But then he went on to apply the message to the conscience of the hearers, who were almost exclusively Jews, when he said, and you put him to death. So it wasn't just the transfer of information, it was the application to the conscience. They were cut to the quick. So then they said, what must we do? An issue of will, to which he said, you must repent, which is at the heart of all the 7 apostolic sermons in Acts, by the way. It's in every sermon. Michael Green actually said, if you do an analysis of all the evangelistic presentations in Acts, they all have the same 3 things. Can you guess what they are? If you were to do an analysis of every presentation in Acts, for example, Acts 2, to the Jews, Acts 17 to the pagans. What's common in each of those presentations? Resurrection. Yeah, number 2. Resurrection's in everyone. The cross isn't mentioned in Mars Hill, for example. It probably was, because you can't have a resurrection without a death, but it's not there in the text. The first thing was, there's only one God who made us, to whom we're accountable. Always started with that. Second, he raised Jesus from the dead. Third, you've got to repent or you'll face judgment. It's in every sermon. Which raises questions for how we proclaim the gospel. I cannot understand why some people preach the cross without the resurrection. Some evangelicals, because of deficiencies or distortions by liberals in the understanding of the cross, tend to have such a strong emphasis on the cross that they neglect the resurrection. And how 1 Corinthians 15 therefore fits into their theological framework, and I don't know, because Paul says without the resurrection we're of all men most hopeless. So those are the dimensions Michael Green said. Anyway, Lloyd-Jones said you go through those phases, the mind, the conscience, the will, then the emotions. There was great praise. Now, he said the 2 classic mistakes that most evangelists make are, first, they start with the mind and stop there. He said this is the big concern for apologists, who run the risk of just presenting, this is the evidence, these are the facts, take it or leave it. Go and think about it. That wasn't the approach for Paul and Peter. They went straight for the conscience and said, if this is true, you cannot remain indifferent. You've got to make a move. And that is often the weakness of the apologist, is addressing the mind and stopping there. But he said the counter weakness is that the person who reacts against the obsessive focus on content that you find sometimes with apologists and try to go straight to the emotions. So you have some preachers who say, avoid the mind, go straight for the emotions or the heart. And he said, what happens there typically is you get a quick and a spurious response, and it's murder to get people a second time round. Because unless you understand the core of the gospel, it's difficult to respond to it. The mind is involved. But he said that's the order. Mind, conscience, will, and emotions. The whole person. And that's why, if ever I'm preparing an evangelistic sermon, I always ask myself those 4 questions. Have I targeted all elements of the human character and personality? A second test I applied from the same conversation with Lloyd-Jones was when he said to me, the 3 buttons to press, if you like, he didn't actually use that phrase, but the 3 emphases you need to have in all evangelistic and apologetic presentations are demonstrating the biblical revelation and the gospel is true. Secondly, demonstrating it's powerful. And he said often the Reformed folks are very strong in demonstrating it's objectively true and defensible. Often Pentecostals are the edge in emphasizing the power of the gospel, but he said the missing dimension is demonstrating the gospel is wonderful. And if a communicator or a preacher's communicated the gospel is wonderful, you never hear people say to them at the door afterwards, nice message this morning, because they haven't hit the wonder button. That's why whenever I'm preaching evangelistically, I go through the whole sermon and ask myself, is there something in here, either through the explanation of the text or an illustration I'm using, which somehow communicates the profound wonder of the gospel? Am I communicating this is the greatest message in the history of the world, there's nothing like it, and you'd be a fool not to believe it or trust in the person of Christ at the heart of it? I think one of the things we need to pray for with our evangelists and proclaimers is that we would be able to, in a fresh way, frequently communicate the wonder of the gospel. This is why people went to hear Lloyd-Jones, incidentally. He successively communicated. There was something in his ministry which communicated this gospel is unbeatable and it's wonderful. Too many apologists just lapse into the idea of, well, I present the facts and then it's over to you. Doesn't seem to be a particularly strong emphasis in Acts, actually. That's not downplaying the apologia, the reasoned defense. We need that, but we have to go further in communicating the gospel is wonderful. I'll use an illustration of that afterwards about a friend who was a Muslim in university who became a Christian. He is now one of the top investment bankers in the world. How the wonder of the gospel struck him. So those are 2 of the things that I observed from Lloyd-Jones. In that same conversation, I asked him if he had any tips for a young person just beginning in Christian ministry. And I was thinking of the time of doing some formal theological training. And he said to me, you don't need to do that. I've never said this in a public meeting because I don't want to play down the importance of formal theological training. But he said, the key thing is to learn to think theologically, not necessarily to have formal theological training. He said many young people, this is why he was a little bit skeptical himself, and of course he didn't have formal theological training himself. He said the key thing is that many young men, especially who are preachers, they have 3 years of formal theological training, but they haven't learned to think how to communicate and apply the doctrinal content, for example, in a pastoral or other ways in their communication. And he said, therefore, to deal with that issue, what you need to do is to keep up your reading. I've never forgotten that. He said, the problem for many young people, even those who have done formal theological training, is they stop reading. And he said, you need to read widely. A friend of mine wrote a brilliant 4-page article, I can send it to you if you want, the joys and the weaknesses of habits of reading. His name was Geraint Fielder. Mark knows him. It was published in the Banner of Truth magazine. Brilliant article on how to read as a Christian minister. Published about 40 years ago. I sent it to people all over the world. It was so helpful. In which he stresses, read books that are inspirational, biographies, autobiographies, missionary stories, and so on, and read theological works which stretch your thinking as well. Interesting, Lloyd-Jones said to me, I've never been a speed reader, he said. I've never been able to read more than 20 pages in an hour maximum. But he said, what I concentrate on is absorbing the core of what the individual is saying. May I just say that Francis Schaeffer said the same thing when I asked him a question about this in L'Abri some years later. He was brilliant at answering questions. I'll come on to that afterwards. But one of the questions he was asked one evening, on a Saturday evening, was, how do you manage to see all these films and watch these plays and read these books of philosophical work? Where do you find the time for it when you're in a busy ministry? He said, I don't. He said, I read the reviews every week. 8 pages of reviews of the new films, the new books, the new plays in the theatre. And if the reviews hint at something which I should investigate further, then I investigate further. I've been doing that for 45 years since I heard Schaeffer do that. I have 25 box files of articles on different themes from A to Z, which I've taken from the weekly culture bulletin produced by the Times. It's 8 pages, that's all. And every week I read it, I get one quote evangelistically, because they usually interview some kind of celebrity, an actor or actress. These days they ask them, are they spiritual beings, or what do they think about death? And you get a choice quote from a contemporary writer there, as well as the best books being reviewed, films, art exhibitions, which are also very important. So the combination of both what Lloyd-Jones and Schaeffer said was very helpful. There's more I could say there, but let me just say one other thing about Lloyd-Jones, which I think many people who love him, especially in my Welsh context and the British context, most people who tried to copy him have completely missed. I heard him preach many times from the time I was a teenager, and what was distinctive about his style was he'd spend the first 15 minutes dealing with a contemporary question. This is what he would do. He'd toss a question up in the air, and he'd say, this was in 1968, in the time of the counterculture. He said, many young people these days are searching for, they want to find utopia. He actually said, they want to get back to the garden, which was an old song. Those of you who are 70-ish will remember from the late 60s. We got to get back to the garden, Crosby, Stills and Nash, I think it was. And he said, so he was listening to the pop records as well. Many people want to get back to the garden. And then he said, let me just tell you how people across the ages have tried to get back to the garden. And then, without quoting these guys, he gave a 15-minute overview of the history of Western philosophy, from Socrates, Plato, through to Spinoza, through to the birth of the United Nations, all demonstrating an attempt to find a utopia or a better world. And after 15 minutes, he said, it's been a great effort, and it's failed. And you just felt this was a congregation with not many students, a sense of pathos. And then he said, now let me tell you how to get back to the garden. And then he preached the gospel. It was so powerful. Now, what a lot of people copied from him, if we ever read or heard his sermons, were he was a brilliant Bible expositor, and he could plunder half a verse. So I've heard so many preachers just try to plunder half a verse like him, often without putting the half verse in the context of the chapter or the whole book, and completely missing the first 15 minutes. So often you could look around the room and you could see people thinking, oh, well, I am thinking this question. How did he know? And that's what he was doing. That's the psychological dimension, starting with a contemporary question. Or maybe he wrote a book called Faith on Trial, an exposition of Psalm 73, which looked at the question of Asaph's Psalm of Lament, about the progress of the wicked, which is a very good contemporary psalm today when you look at Putin and other things. Why is it that the wicked seem to progress and life is so rough for those who are not and have integrity? And he used that to speak to the contemporary world, which is a great psalm for today, and then the biblical answer. So he'd typically start with a contemporary existential question being raised in the culture, play with it for 15 minutes with various quotes and illustrations, and then take people to the scripture. not straight to the scripture, usually. It was quite brilliant to watch. And you just immediately felt this message is relevant to the kind of world we're living in today. And I always remember listening to him. I wanted to do this actually in Oxford when he's preaching. And I took a guy who was playing rugby for England. He was 6'3" and 18 stone. Was that 250 pounds? So he was about 6 inches taller than me, with big sideburns down here. A really tough guy who played rugby for England. And at the end of the sermon, I turned to him and I said, "What do you think of it, Phil?" He was in tears. This big, powerful guy. Everybody else was frightened of him. And I said, "What do you think of it?" He said, "I think it's true." And I said, "Well, if it's true, there's only one option. You've got to make a move." And then sadly, he said to me, "I can't. What will the boys think?" Then I took my heart in my mouth and I said, "Oh, Phil, don't be a wimp." And moved quickly to the men's room for a break. Anyway, that's a bit about Lloyd-Jones. I better move on to the second, John Stott, who is a contemporary, though about 10 years younger. I met John many times because he was vice president of IFES, or honorary vice president when I was general secretary. And I first remember meeting him as a student when he came to speak on 3 nights on Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. What were some of his great strengths? He was the clearest speaker I ever heard, clearer than Lloyd-Jones. Very precise, wrote all his sermons out, which incidentally extended his ministry because he had a series of small seizures in his mid-70s. But because he wrote everything out, I remember being in a meeting where he just forgot where he was at one point. He said, "Just give me a moment," looked down at the written script, and he homed in on it. It added about 5 to 10 years on his public ministry. I can't do that, neither can any Welshman really, because we're too spontaneous. But he was crystal clear. So when my son started off in Christian ministry, he said to me, "Do you have any tips, Dad?" I said, "Well, John Stott wrote 51 books. If you read those, you won't go very far wrong." He's so crystal clear on many of the key issues. 1 or 2 people might contend that he held to. But I thought he was clear, especially on issues like baptism and fullness of the Spirit. I thought he nailed the understanding or meaning of the biblical text better than Lloyd-Jones, for whom I couldn't understand his view on that, where he got it from in Scripture. So he's very clear, very centered, Christologically centered, very centered on pointing people to the person of Christ. Interestingly, I met with him very often under the auspices of the Lausanne movement, with whom I was involved for about 9 years, because he, of course, was a key player in the Lausanne movement and the Lausanne Covenant, which is one of the great documents in the history of the church, which he penned by staying up overnight for 2 nights, by the way. Boy, if I could write like that without any sleep, I'd be very happy. But it's a great document if you can read it, and with seminal statements on things like evangelism and social concern, which was, as always, a source of tension between believers. But classically, he said, these 2 things are like the wings of a bird or like the 2 blades of a scissors. You can't have one without the other. If you want precedence, then Jesus preached to the 5,000 first, and then he fed them. The disciples took the line of many evangelicals, just preach to them. But Jesus said, no, feed them as well. But he didn't just say feed them either. He preached them as well. So it's beautifully balanced. And he kept that balance right to the end of his life. Evangelicals often struggle with this issue, and it's been a source of contention over the last 100 years or so. Then he talked about holding the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, and engagement with the culture. Evangelicals have always struggled with the issue of how to relate to the culture. And some people have argued for separation, that the majority of Christian church has done that, including the one I was converted in. I think it's unbiblical. As a reaction to that, some have argued for assimilation of the culture into the church, which is issued in liberal theology, a desupernaturalization of the gospel and so on. But the third way, which John Stott emphasized, was engagement in the culture without being infected by it. And he had this, again, very choice statement, wonderful statement. I wish I had it on the PowerPoint, but I don't. But here it is. The calling to the Christian church is to be morally distinct without being socially segregated, and we've confused the two. So that in the cultural context in the church I grew up in, many teenagers were converted. Someone was converted every day for a period of 6 months during the counterculture in the late 60s after a visit by Arthur Blessitt, for those of you who may remember him. And the church leaders panicked, and they thought, what are we going to do with all these teenagers? 250 in the youth group when we had 15 a year ago. What are we going to do with them and help them not to be corrupted if they want to go to parties or watch cinema and so on? And one of the deacons had a bright idea. He said, I know what to do. Let's arrange a meeting every night of the week and tell them that if they become members of the church, they've got to come to every one. So they can't get into parties or meet with non-Christians. What happened? They lost a lot of them eventually because they weren't teaching us how to critically engage with the culture. Now, John Stott's theological justification for this viewpoint engagement is found in the incarnation of Christ, who retained his deity but came and dwelt among us. And memorably, he said, and was known as the friend of sinners. And the question all of us have to ask is, do we have any friends who are sinners? Boy, that was a sting when I heard him say that. Anyway, he had some of these beautiful statements which are memorably put together in his writings. But alongside this, I think one of the things that really struck me about him, as actually with all of these 5 or 6 people, is he was so humble. I remember going to visit him just before he died. He was in a retirement home, and his short-term memory was beginning to go and feeling weak. And I said, John, I've come to say, I thought it might be the last time I see him. I said, I've come to say thank you for your contribution to evangelicalism. And he said to me, oh, I haven't done that much. Wish I could have done more. He said, if I was 25 years younger, I'd come and join you in this evangelism amongst students. That's what I'd really like to do. And I thought, haven't done much. You've written 51 books. You wrote the Lausanne Covenant. You've preached to large crowds in your church. You initiated university mission weeks across the UK and then globally. You developed the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity. You've influenced and mentored so many young leaders. Haven't done much. So then at his Thanksgiving and funeral service, Chris Wright spoke on the following text from Numbers. And Moses was the greatest man in the East and the humblest. And he said, that's John Stott. And he was. I never heard him use a personal illustration. I use them all the time because I haven't got enough content to flesh out the sermon otherwise. But he told me I'm not very good at telling stories, he said. So he was very biblically orientated. He was keen to exegete the text of Scripture. Exposition goes a little bit further because it includes illustration and application as well. Lloyd-Jones just had a slight edge there, and that psychological and greater emotional depth, I would say. But Stott had the edge as an exegete, I would say. It was a privilege to have those two greats in our own generation. The third person is Francis Schaeffer, the only American I'm going to mention in this group. Had a profound influence on my wife, he rescued her, I would say, when she went to L'Abri with huge questions, studying French existentialism in university. And the interesting thing about Schaeffer was he's the best answer of questions I ever heard. And I watched his style, which is very interesting. On Saturday nights in L'Abri in Switzerland, he'd come in and he'd just sit down. There's this fireplace, and he'd sit down next to it. And then he'd say, right, what's the first question? No sermon. I'd never seen this before. And then you had all these, many Westerners, especially Americans, it was that kind of era, where many with second or third culture kids, and they were angry with their parents because they were born in the States, or their American parents, and they were parents of missionaries in Nepal or Afghanistan or something. And they didn't know, am I American, am I Nepali, where do I fit, and so on. They were angry over some of these things and had big questions. And you just watched them throwing hand grenades of questions. How on earth can you believe this? And some of them were really irate. And he would just go, catch. And then when they had vented, he took time to answer the question. And then he'd say, have I answered your question? And he'd go back to the person if the question wasn't answered, because he was trying to treat them with dignity. Now, my wife tasted this for the first time. We weren't very good at answering questions in Wales. We tend to give proof texts. So you're in a meeting with young people. Right, what text am I thinking of? So you're treating them like lemons where they're incapable of thinking, unfortunately. But she turned up to this meeting, and she just thought to herself, this is amazing. You can ask any question you like, and he'll try to provide an answer. And his thesis was that the Bible doesn't give exhaustive answers to the big questions in life, but it gives us sufficient in order to believe. So those two words were key. We aren't told everything we would like to know, or we could know, because we're finite. But God gives us sufficient, and what's more, the best answer to the questions. Can I say Tim Keller was really good at this too? And in some ways copied Lloyd-Jones's style. He was brilliant at answering questions. And if I were to add another American, probably he would be the most significant in recent generations like that. He wasn't the preacher that Lloyd-Jones was. He adopted a different style, particularly because he was in Manhattan, and you knew that if you shouted, as Welsh people like to, that it wouldn't fit. You had to be more careful and reasoned. Anyway, Schaeffer was brilliant at answering these questions, and he had this, where's the pen now? I will use something on here. Any of you know anything about L'Abri? Please read the L'Abri story, you'll find out. One of the things he talked about in asking questions was, he said, many people have a worldview which makes them live in a house with no doors and no windows. You can't get into them. It's closed. So what you have to do is you have to take the roof off their position, and you go in through the roof. And how do you do that? By asking questions. That's how you open them up. So one American friend has written a book called Questioning Evangelism, and Schaeffer talked about this as the lost art of the evangelist, including the proclaimer. So that I watched, particularly Lloyd-Jones and Stott, they often used and Michael Green, key questions to force people to take the roof off a person's position, to provoke them to think in the congregation. If I may, let me give an illustration from my own experience working with students. I was speaking on the theme of suffering, hell, and the God of love in a university mission week. And afterwards, 3 young guys came on to me. It was a team of 3 on full frontal attack. And they said, we can't possibly believe in God because there's so much suffering in the world. I just read Tim Keller's sermon at the center in New York, where he had dealt with this question brilliantly in 5 minutes, if you can get hold of it, where he said, and I was copying it, frankly, I said to him, the 3 students, okay, supposing you're right, and there isn't a God, you're still left with the problem of suffering. Who are you going to blame? How are you going to deal with it? I said, I just lost my mother with brain cancer. Can you imagine sitting next to her for 6 months and saying to her, there's no God, there's no answer, and there's no hope. Tell me honestly how you would feel about that. And no answer. And so that to me shows the value of being able to raise questions with people which push people back and back and back in terms of taking the roof off. And the great thing about that is if you ask enough questions, as Jesus did, T.S. Eliot said Jesus was that man who never stopped asking difficult questions, which is an interesting way of defining Jesus' ministry. And Schaeffer recaptured this emphasis, I think, where most preachers feel they have failed if they haven't preached the whole message. But alongside that, it's wise to mix it up with illustrations and questions, by all means trying to penetrate the defenses of the people who are before us. So he was brilliant at asking questions. And I remember my wife being in one of these meetings where somebody asked what everybody else thought was a really dumb question. And they all laughed. Everybody listening, except for Schaeffer. And he just said to this guy who was from a non-Western culture, I can see that's a serious question for you. Let me try to give you a serious answer. Those who were laughing felt somewhat humiliated, and the dignity of the person listening just went up like that. People wanted to talk with him more because he sought to treat them with dignity. And we can't understand Schaeffer's ministry unless we understand that on the one hand, he was persuaded of the truth claims of the gospel and communicating it clearly and objectively. But on the other hand, he had great tenderness and compassion. He was a weeper and a very emotional person, actually, with quite a fiery temper as well, which is an encouragement for others who might have one. There is a story told of sometimes when the temperature was rising in the family, there was a potted plant in the corner of the room of the house. And as Schaeffer got more and more angry with the family, he'd move towards the potted plant, pick it up and throw it across the room. This was quite a common family trait. So as time moved on, as the children got older, and they saw the temperature rising, some of them would go over and sit on top of the potted plant, which of course would take the pressure down. Now, just to show the emotion of some of these people, I'm going to tell you a similar story about Lloyd-Jones, okay? When he retired from preaching in London, his daughter and his son-in-law, who was a vice president of the European Community, were living in Cambridge. And he used to go there on weekends to write his life history with his wife. And on Sunday morning, they'd go to church together. And they'd always discuss the sermon Sunday lunchtime. Anyway, they went to this church in Cambridge, and there was a young preacher this one Sunday morning. And afterwards, they came back for lunch, and Lloyd-Jones asked the question, what did you think of the sermon this morning? Or his daughter did. And Lloyd-Jones was quite critical of this young preacher. His wife was pretty feisty, and she said, well, Martyn, I don't know who you were listening to, but I thought the young man did very well. Then they started to argue publicly with voices raising, one in defense of the young preacher and the other trying to take it apart. At which point there was a French au pair living with the family at the time, and the blood drained from her face as she went more and more pale. And Elizabeth Catherwood, as she was, or Lloyd-Jones, before she was married, then turned to the young au pair and said, is everything okay? Are you feeling okay? She said, no, she said, we have a saying in France that when the temperature rises like this, the swords come off the wall. So that belies the idea that amongst the best preachers, they just have an even temperament where they never raise their... That very passion fuels the proclamation of the message because they're touched by the power of the message. Schaeffer had some brilliant phrases. I don't have time to go through many of them, but I mentioned sufficient over against exhaustive knowledge. I think God gave him some great phrases. One of the best was to describe the human condition. He used the term that we are glorious ruins. How do you explain, his question was, how do you explain the way that human beings are today? How is it that we have the capacity for great acts of philanthropy, kindness, generosity, tenderness on the one hand, and the same person could possibly kill somebody or behave badly to family members? How is that possible? And his answer was, well, the Bible teaches we are glorious ruins. We bear something of the glory of being made in God's image. So we have the capacity to love, communicate, create, capacity to be tender, compassionate, but we're also ruined by the impact of sin corrupting in our world, and so we can behave in a bestial fashion as well. It's one of the best definitions of the human condition that I've heard. It's not just that we are fallen, but there's something of the beauty of being made in God's image as well in us. And that would explain, though, sometimes you get Carlos the Jackal, the terrorist who killed lots of people in Paris. I remember his Vergès was his lawyer defending him, and he said in the law court, even the best of men have secret corruptions, and even the worst of men, like my client, have tender gardens in their soul which they tend from time to time. A glorious ruin. So Well, there's so much more I could say about Schaeffer, but let me just say also that what he tried to combine, you can understand his influence on Lebris, unless you understand that he emphasized truth, the truth claims of the gospel, lived out in community. Now, a lot of people who never went to Lebris or didn't read the book or the history of Lebris, they picked up the intellectual dimension, communication, but they didn't realize it was all fleshed out over 3-hour meals at lunchtime every day, where they just ask Andrew Fellows, who's here, or Stefan Gustafsson, who all tasted this, both of whom worked with Lebris, although Stefan never actually met Schaeffer. He was too young when Schaeffer died. But my wife talks about hearing these sermons, which defended the truth claims of the gospel, then going for these lengthy lunches where you could ask any question you want. And the Lebris leaders were trained in responding to people's questions and taking time to explain the answers. When he was once asked about the tension between reason and faith, in response to the question, what's your take on the phrase blind faith? He didn't like that at all, because he said faith has an object, the person of Jesus Christ, and we express faith because of the evidence for his deity and his death and his resurrection. It happened in time and space and history, and we can evaluate the evidence, as Luke does, where he talks about the evidences and the proofs and so on. Paul did this all the way through Acts, of course, in his communication. And he used this illustration to try and bring it home. He was living in the Swiss Alps, and he said, you imagine you're climbing a sheer-faced rock. There was one very near to Lebris called Le Miroir, the mirror. And you were climbing up this rock, he said, and as often happens in the mountains, a thick fog came down of cloud, and you couldn't even see 2 meters above you or 2 meters below. But you had climbing with you, you were with a team, and there was another rock climber on a ledge below you, just about 7 or 8 feet. You couldn't see him because of the thick fog. And the man on the ledge below would say, just let go, I've got you, I'll catch you here. You can trust me, it's okay. You probably wouldn't let go unless you'd ask, first of all, how big are you? Can you carry my weight? Is the ledge under you strong enough? How tense and how strong are the ropes? And if you had enough time to ask some of those questions, you might make a move then of letting go into the hands of the person below you who could catch you. And he said, in a way, it's like this with belief in the truth claims of the gospel and exercising faith based on the evidence which God has given to us. John Stott famously said of that issue also, we must not pander to people's intellectual curiosity, but we must give answers to people's real questions. There's no substitute for faith, prayer, and love, but God gives evidences and reasons for the truth claims of the gospel message. Brilliant statement by Stott. So they obviously implied the same thing. So take the phrase, a step of blind faith, out of our lexicon for a kickoff, because none of them believe that nonsense. Because, of course, many people talk of Christian faith as just believing in something basically you know isn't true. That's the atheistic scientists in Oxford's perspective on the nature of faith, Dawkins, but it's not biblical faith. David Watson was lesser known because he died at 51. He was probably the most gifted university evangelist I ever met. What I observed from him, because he did an 8-day university mission week when I was a student, at which 150 students professed faith. That's why I believe in public proclamation in the university, because so many people were converted in that week. He enunciated the phrase teaching evangelism, which is relevant especially today, by which he meant it's not just a question of preaching the simple gospel, but because people have less biblical knowledge, but are nevertheless asking questions, what you have to do is to start by teaching the biblical answer to the big questions in life. From where can I find a sense of meaning, significance, purpose? Answer to the question of the search for love. Answer to the question of suffering. So you teach the biblical position on those things, and then you apply it evangelistically. which is very necessary in an increasingly secularized culture where most people have never been to Sunday school and have no knowledge of biblical stories. The second thing I observed in him was that he was an extrovert and prone to depression. Now, coming from the South Wales coal mining valleys, I didn't know what an introvert was because everybody shouts there and fights their corner. That's the kind of family I grew up in. And having been converted as a teenager and told to preach in the open air 5 days later, because one of the deacons said to me, "You know enough to be saved, so you know enough to tell other people." But I didn't have much clue. But I thought an evangelist was somebody who shouted at people. Until I met this guy who spoke in a monotone, as incidentally did John Stott most of the time. So a lot of Celtic people, they might have looked a little bit boring. But I remember listening to David Watson give the best address I've ever heard on the subject of suffering, hell, and a God of love, which has been printed in his book, In Search of God, which has the 8 sermons that he gave in Oxford during that mission week. I read it once every year before speaking in university mission weeks. I was sitting right at the back with 1,000 students in the Oxford Union listening. The man didn't raise his voice, and I thought, there's remarkable power here, and I don't understand why. He's not shouting. And it's because I realized the Holy Spirit was speaking through him, and that it wasn't, the speech wasn't determined, the impact wasn't determined by being an extrovert personality or shouting. Then he wedded together the verbal and the visual, and classically started to bring in the use of the visual arts in his presentations, which was brilliant, because what I learned from that is that some people, they pick things up by just observing visually. Some just like to hear carefully reasoned things. My son, if I send him an email, he doesn't respond. If I send him a photograph or a picture, I get a phone call or an email back within 10 minutes because he's an arts perspective. There's another person who works with the artists in Wales. Her name is Lois, you know her, Mark. She's exactly the same. People complain she never responds to emails. When I send her a painting, she's on the phone within 10 minutes. It's a different way of thinking. So what he did was, without playing down the importance of public proclamation, he added in the use of drama, dramatic sketches, music, poetry, and then subsequently there were others, my wife is one of them, who uses paintings to illustrate things. For instance, Gauguin's painting, Whence, What, Whither, where do we come from, who are we, where we're going, because it's a reflection on the meaning and purpose of life. And typically, David Watson would speak for 40-45 minutes, but it wasn't a straight talk. He'd speak for 20 minutes, and somebody would do a dramatic presentation of Job chapter 1. And then he'd comment on that and speak to it about the problem of suffering has been there from the beginning. It's there in the oldest book of the Bible. So, it's a big question. We need to answer it. He'd start into it, and then after 20 minutes, he'd say, now I'm going to interview somebody who's in the midst of suffering, somebody who has cancer. You'd have this powerful testimony. Then he'd carry on and then have a song on the same theme, and then a call to people to respond. Well, I looked at my watch after an hour and a quarter, and I thought, it's just gone like that. And the guy spoke for 45 minutes or more, and I didn't realize, because he was coming from different angles, connecting with people at different points, which is rooted in Paul's teaching that by all means we are trying to communicate the gospel to people. The area where we are weakest in gospel proclamation in the world is amongst the people studying the humanities or the arts. In IFES, for whom I've been working for 45 years, about 400,000 students involved around the world. For 30 years at least, 70% of them have been scientists. Christian engineers are 2 a penny. I'm sorry to say, Mark, so are many doctors. But you try to find a Christian who's an artist or a philosophy student, or these days a literature student, because of what postmodernity has done to the study of texts. They're much less evident. And the church has to do much more work to try to connect with those people. That incidentally is where Schaeffer also was very good in connecting with people from the visual arts. So he brought the visual and the verbal together and emphasized very much working in teams, not just the preacher on their own. Well, all of these folks have written great books that are worth reading. I can mention them at the end if you want, but I want to rush on to give you time for a few questions. Michael Green was almost the equal of David Watson. Massive extrovert. I lived next to him for 3 years and worked with him subsequently for 16 years until he died. Quite different in temperament. Absolutely fearless, though only 5 feet 5 tall, and a mega extrovert, and very direct. And I saw him, before John Lennox started doing this, taking people who are hostile to the gospel on in public dialogue. I'll never forget, as a student, the two most senior theologians in the university were very liberal, the professor of New Testament and the professor of systematic theology. And on a Sunday morning, instead of doing a Bible exposition, he said, let's have a debate with one of them about the trustworthiness of Luke, of the authorship of Luke Acts. Now, it's hard to imagine that's an evangelistic talk, but he asked this professor to speak first, who gave his take on it. He didn't believe Luke wrote both Luke and Acts. And then he took the argument apart without reading any notes whatsoever, like a barrister going through the arguments bit by bit, or people slicing through cheese. I could see this professor going down like this. And then he couldn't respond. And so Michael challenged him to another debate, and he said, only on condition you speak first, I see your text, and you can't respond to what I have to say. But I tell you what that did. There were a lot of theologians there. It convinced, who were being taught by these liberal theologians, it convinced them there are answers to what these guys are saying, but we've got to do the research. And he used to meet with them each week to help them to respond to the liberal arguments. He rescued at least 2 people who are now evangelical bishops in the Anglican Church, who were on the same CU committee as me 45 years ago, because they used to go to these dialogues with him, and they observed him defend the gospel. The other thing he did was, if he was giving an evangelistic talk, he'd ask for the names of some non-Christian students and go and visit them and say, I'm going to give a talk on this on Sunday morning. Could you have a look at it, please? Tell me if you understand all the language in it, so I can adjust it if there's nothing. And he would change the text and the meaning and the use of words if he was lapsing into theological jargon. Now that requires a fair amount of self-confidence to be able to do that, take it from a non-Christian. And often I saw the non-Christians turning up and they were converted within the next 6-8 weeks, because he had taken the time to engage with them and to ask for their input. He had a beautiful statement about the role of the evangelist. He said, the role of the evangelist is to electrify the fence that people are sitting on. In other words, to force people into a response. He never left people sitting at the end of a meeting thinking, oh, that was a nice message to listen to. But he left them feeling, I must respond one way or the other to this. And I had a beautiful illustration a few weeks ago. I went to meet one of the most senior bankers in one of the 3 biggest banks in the world. He was the chief executive, and he was converted from a Muslim background as a student. So I asked him, I won't say which bank, but I asked him, how did you become a Christian? He said, well, when I was a student in Oxford, I was studying law. I wanted to be a barrister. He said, my grandfather was a billionaire, as was my father. I came from a fabulously wealthy family. I came up to university and I just wanted to have a wealthy job as a top barrister. He said, I never thought about the Christian faith. And in the last semester of my studies, I went to this party by the river where they were giving out strawberries and cream. And he said, this small guy came up to me, Michael Green, and he said, hello, you're obviously from another country. This guy was not British. And he said to him, what are your religious convictions? And he said, oh, I come from a really committed Muslim family. And Michael Green said, have you ever considered the claims of Jesus Christ? He said, never even thought about him. He said, well, before you finish in university in 5 weeks' time, I suggest you ask the 2 biggest questions you need to ask. As Jesus Christ clearly claimed to be God in the text of the Bible, which I want to give you a copy of so you could read it for yourself, ask yourself the question, was he beyond reasonable doubt who he claimed to be or not, God or not? And secondly, ask yourself, did he rise from the dead? Because if he did rise from the dead, it's the greatest truth in history. If he didn't, it's the greatest hoax in history. Those are two defining questions. Why don't you go and think them over? He said that was the sum total of the conversation. I went away. He said I couldn't sleep. The Holy Spirit had lodged the two questions in my mind. I couldn't get rid of them. And he said 3 weeks later, I was in the kingdom. I told my family, huge response negatively. But subsequently, many of them became believers. I learned from that it's very important, even if you're having a ferocious debate with a non-Christian, always to try to leave them with a question. Thank you for the discussion. We obviously have different perspectives. Can I encourage you to have a look at the claims of Jesus Christ anyway? And ask about the evidence for the resurrection? I had the same experience at the funeral of a friend last week I went to speak at in North Wales, who was a great poet, but her son said to me, I knew she longed for him to become a Christian, so I thought I've got to do what his mother would want me to do. I asked him after the funeral, well, what's your take on the claims of Jesus? I quoted this Muslim friend who'd become a Christian, the two big questions. He said, I'm not interested in organized religion. I said, well, I'm not either. But when it comes to what your mother believed, I think you should try and answer those two questions. And let me lob you a third one. How long have your Christians been parents? Your parents been Christians? About 60 years, he said. I said, can you honestly say both your parents are mistaken for 6 decades? Go and think about it. So we can have a talk when we go back from this conference afterwards, because I wanted to honor her testimony over the years. The other great thing about Michael Green is he finished well. He did well over 100 university missions. I worked with him for 15, 16 years at the end of his life. And I was speaking at one of these week-long missions in Dundee in Scotland. And on the Monday evening, the first night, the phone went at 7 o'clock. I was due to get up and speak at 7:30. It was Michael. He said, hi, Lindsay, this is Michael here. I said, oh, why are you calling, Michael? He said, well, I think I'm going to heaven tomorrow. He said, I'm having a heart operation. The doctors told me there's less than 10% chance of me reviving after the operation. Says, I'm phoning up to say thanks for being a friend. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to preach at my funeral. And here's the text from 2 Timothy 4. I've completed the task. He said, I want you to tell them I've completed the task, I'm ready to go, and I'm there when you're speaking. So he said, don't beat about the bush. Don't spend much time talking about me. Tell them what the gospel is that I believed. He finished well. He said, I think I've finished the race that God gave me to fulfill. There's just one last task I've got. He said, all the doctors and nurses who are coming to visit me, he said, I have about 20 copies of my books by the side of the bed. I'm giving them all one each and telling them you need to consider and follow Jesus because he's the real deal. So he's doing it until just before he went into the operating theatre, right at the end. You know, when you see people like that, John Stott, I was telling somebody this morning, you know, when he was dying, he called his best friend in, a lifelong friend, and they'd arranged this beforehand. He said, when you know I'm going, I want you to sit by my bedside and play the Hallelujah chorus as I leave. Finish well. You know, when you see great believers believing like that, true, there's hypocrisy in the church. True, there are some leaders who are failures. But there are enough good examples for us to say, it works. And there are enough good models for us to say, I'm going to follow that kind of example. Last one is John Lennox, who many of you may have heard here, and is the only contemporary one. I don't have so much time to speak with John. I've known him since, 47 years, when he was an unknown young lecturer in Cardiff University, and used to disappear on weekends to go to Eastern Europe to teach elders in churches. Whole books he'd teach for 10 hours on a Saturday. Then they would use this for teaching in churches subsequent weeks. He'd go back several times a year, particularly in brethren churches. He only became well known internationally at about 48 years of age. And he said to me, you know, I'm not doing much that's different from what I did before, which was teaching the Bible. And he was known in student circles in Europe and amongst brethren Christian communities. The lesson there is that John realized that when these doors opened for his debate with Dawkins and others, it was God who opened the door. He wasn't actually doing much different. but he wasn't well known. And so he wasn't proud about it, because it wasn't he who opened the door, it was God who opened the door for him. Or actually, it was the Lord answering his wife's prayers, Sally, because she said to him, he was going to be offered 3 times a chair, a professor's position, but his senior supervisor, a guy called Vikramasinghe, a famous scientist, was opposed to John's Christian convictions, so he vetoed it each time. And his wife said to him, in his mid-40s, "You're never going to get a professorship, so I'm going to pray that God moves you out of here." And within a year, he was in Oxford, and he had the debate with Dawkins, who didn't know him because he had just arrived. That hit the websites and YouTube, and lots of dialogues and debates occurred subsequently. I want to just close and mention 2 or 3 things about John. The first is his distinctive style. He wasn't the evangelistic preacher that some of the others like Lloyd-Jones or Stott were, but he is the scientific example of what C.S. Lewis did for us in the world of literature and the arts. He is probably, my guess is, probably the most outstanding evangelical statesman alive in Europe today. But he's also very humble. And I watched him in debate, how he speaks to people who you might call his opponents. He treats people, as Schaeffer did, with dignity. Let me give an illustration. He was once invited to a debate with Peter Singer, the ethicist in Australia, who has completely different worldview, especially vis-a-vis abortion, end-of-life issues, and so on. And this guy, Peter Singer, has been attacked by many evangelicals for his view on end-of-life or beginning-of-life issues. John read all his books before the debate. And then I'm not sure if it was in Sydney Opera House or one of the big theatres in Australia. And when they got up to speak, first of all, John said, "I'm looking forward to the dialogue this evening. I've read all of Peter Singer's books, and there are 2 I'd like to encourage everybody to read." And people look shocked. How on earth can you recommend any of these books? They weren't books that cut across the Christian worldview. And afterwards, Peter Singer took him aside privately and said, "I want to thank you for the way you treated me this evening, John. I've had a lot of hate mail from evangelicals. I've never debated with anybody who's treated me with dignity as you did tonight. And because of that, I'm speaking at a major event tomorrow night. Would you please come as my guest of honor?" Now that's the mark of a statesman, an evangelical statesman who looks at the big picture and recognizes even the most fallen and hostile of human beings is still made in God's image. And that's a tough one for us to grasp, because we can easily just view them as enemies, and he's done that with many. Secondly, a whole group of some of the younger evangelists here. Some years ago we were doing a mission week. Actually, Tim Keller was the speaker in Oxford. We invited 6 of the most gifted younger folks, some of whom are leaders now here, to the week to just observe Tim Keller in his style. But during the week we had 3 sessions with 3 different individuals, an hour, where they could ask any question. John Lennox was one of them. One of the leaders here, Zef Nicola from Albania, asked him, "John, in your debate with some of the scientists here, the first one you did, for example, how long did it take you to prepare, to interact and dialogue?" He said, "About 18 months. I read everything that this guy had written. I decided I need to know his arguments inside out and take him on at his strongest points, not the weakest points on the periphery." He learned that from Jurgen Spiess, by the way, a good German friend who sometimes speaks here. And that showed the importance of preparation. Just like Lloyd-Jones was emphasizing reading, he was emphasizing preparation for these kind of debates. Well, the last thing I'd say about John probably is tremendous courage in taking folks on. We have these conferences for about 200 evangelists and academics each year, focusing on the public communication of the gospel, European universities. John takes the 60 academics, and I worked with the evangelists. We started working with the academics because John was speaking at an evangelistic meeting or an apologetic event in the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. He was packed out, and afterwards, about 4 or 5 university lecturers went up to him and identified themselves as Christians, to which he said, "Where have you been?" Because the students have been trying to get a room for this debate or dialogue in the university, and nobody stood up for them. And in the end, it was reluctantly provided by the Vice-Chancellor. We needed those of you who are within academia to defend the students. And he came back from that meeting and he said to me, "Lindsay, we'll have to start something for the academics because they lack courage." And then the students started telling us there are some of these guys who are eminent scientists, particularly, who can speak for 50 minutes on their subject, and they might mention the word God in the last 5 minutes in hushed tones. He said the level of their discipleship and Christian worldview is they've not learned how to apply biblical truth to every sphere of life, including their academic discipline. So he said, we've got a lot of work to equip those academics. They're behind the young evangelists in terms of their connectedness. And so the last 8 years, that's why we've met with 60 of them every year. Most of them are scientists. It's really hard to find the people studying history, which is what I did, or literature or philosophy especially. But our prayer is that God will raise up some of these people. And now they work together with the evangelists in the university context. One last story about him. We went to do one of these events in the University of Novi Sad in northern Serbia a few years back. This shows how good he is on a personal level as well as public. We went into this was a major Marxist university before fall of Marxism. First time an evangelistic event or an apologetic event took place in the university, even in the 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we went to see the Vice-Chancellor, who was a very cagey scientist and clearly didn't really want us to be there at all. John said to him, "What's your discipline?" He told him. He said, "Where have you studied? Where do you do your doctoral research?" He told him. He said, "Who was your supervisor?" He told him. John said, "Oh, I know him." He said, "In fact, I was talking with him the other day. He's done a very interesting piece of research. Can you send me yours? I'd like to read it." I could see the temperatures just going down as John asked questions and showed interest in this person. And then he came to the meeting. And after John spoke, he said, "You should come back here another time." At the end of the meeting, there was a pastor there I'd known for about 15 years. His name was Dusan, pastor of the local Baptist church. And I could see him quietly just weeping in a seat near the front. And I said to him, "Are you okay, brother?" He said, "You don't understand, Lindsay. I've been a pastor here for 20 years. I've been praying for the gospel to be communicated in this university in my town all that time, and the day has arrived." And he said, I never thought it would. I'm so thankful to God. We heard later that one of the professors in the university, somebody told me when I was in Serbia 3 weeks ago, that someone, as a result of that event, became a Christian, who's a senior lecturer today. But what that showed was the personal work alongside the public proclamation, the engagement with and the treatment of individuals, asking questions, dialoguing with them, showing an interest in them, just as Jesus did, and treating them as an individual, rather than using one booklet for everybody, which I don't actually see anywhere in the New Testament. These booklets are useful as starters, but what's striking about Jesus in the New Testament is he treated everybody differently. John chapter 3 talks about you must be born again. I don't think he mentions that anywhere else in the Gospels. The next chapter is rivers of living water. What he was doing was starting where the individuals were and building bridges. It requires more work and an interest in people. But if you do it that way, asking questions along that way, showing genuine interest in people, eventually, by the time you've asked them the 20th question, they say, "Well, what do you think?" And the door is open.